I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, a forum for integrating the life sciences, where we discuss the latest bioscience publications. As a reminder, if you'd like to read more, point your browser to bioscience.oxfordjournals.org, and please follow us on Twitter at BioscienceAIBS. And today, for our very first episode, we're going to be joined by Dr. Jiquan Chen of Michigan State University. He'll be talking to us about coupled human and natural systems, otherwise known as CHANS. We'll discuss the concept more in the interview, but CHANS is an approach that explores the relationships between humans and the natural world, and how those two systems affect each other. More specifically, Dr. Chen works with an interdisciplinary team studying the Mongolian Plateau, which is a sensitive ecosystem. It's also worth noting that Dr. Chen's article for BioScience is part of a special section on CHANS. That's in our June issue, already available online, and it includes an editorial from Dr. Chen that gives an overview of some of the other articles in the section. So without any further ado, let's get to the interview. And I'm joined now by Dr. Chen. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you very much for considering our study.
And just to get us started, if you wouldn't mind, could you give the listeners a sort of a brief overview of what coupled human and natural systems are?
Well, the idea is that we are seeing increasingly connections between man and nature. So this coupled human and natural system is aiming at that connections. Basically, we're focusing on the interactions and the feedbacks between the elements of human systems and the natural systems.
And when roughly did this idea come into being? It seems to bear some similarity to, to older ideas, things like human ecology. But when did this particular approach kind of come into use?
Well, it's a long history because bringing people or man into nature has been there for probably over 100 years. And back to 1921, our pioneer, some of the ecological pioneers, they started bringing people into the nature. So, but really, in my personal view, and scientists began to be getting more serious in early 1970s when the Manned Biosphere program started under the IGBP program of United Nations.
And perhaps in contrast to some of those earlier efforts, one thing I took away from your article and those of the other authors in the special section was a focus on metrics and kind of putting an empirical frame on this approach.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. And because this concept of human nature interactions, as I stated, has been there probably since 1920s. However, this concept really received any quantitative approval. There are lots of good ideas, good concepts. As I stated in editorial comments, back to Rachel Carson's time, that's the famous Silent Springtime back to 1960s. And she started looking at how human influences may placed on nature. And Jared Diamond's book and a series of the books and emphasized the human and the nature interactions. And here, there's a special issue on bioscience, and we're getting towards a more quantitative description, how the elements of human systems and the natural system may interact and feedback to each other. I think that's the uniqueness. So we're getting more empirical or experimental data into this quantitative modeling or description. So then, in a way, we're getting moved towards moving from concepts into reality, and then started to test different hypotheses.
That makes a lot of sense, and I want to get into the quantitative elements of the modeling, but first, your work is conducted on the Mongolian Plateau, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
And just for listeners who may not be as familiar, can you give us an idea of why that is a particularly interesting area for the study of CHANS?
Well, first let me introduce a little bit Mongolia Plateau. If you look at the entire terrestrial ecosystem on Earth's surface, there are a few places that are very geographically distinctive. For example, Tibet Plateau is one of those areas, and the Mongolia Plateau will be another area. The reason that these unique plateaus are very distinctive from other region is because they're high altitude, and it is also in high latitude. And the entire Mongolia Plateau is in the north side of roughly about 42 degrees north. Because of its high latitude and a high altitude, then the region or the plateau is very sensitive to any changes. In a way, the ecologists call that sensitivity, or they're very fragile to the physical change or any external disturbances. For example, if the same warming trend happens to, let's say, the temperate or southern China, and the ecosystem responses on the Mongolia Plateau will be more pronounced simply because it's in high latitude and high altitude. So that's why we call Mongolia Plateau as one of the sensitive region within the Earth systems. So that's a brief introduction of the Mongolia Plateau.
So, from the sound of that description, it sounds like the Mongolian Plateau can be thought of kind of in the same way one might think of the Arctic as a bellwether. So, what makes this system uniquely valuable for studying Chans?
That's a great question, because the reason we have been working on Mongolia Plateau since 2004 was because my team saw a great opportunity, not only because Mongolia Plateau is very sensitive to any change, including climate change or other human activities or any external disturbances. The second reason is because Mongolia Plateau consists of the two major governments. Well, as you stated, one is widely known as Inner Mongolia. That's a part of one of the provinces in China. And then the north side of the Mongolia Plateau is called currently Mongolia. So there are two major governments. This government, they used to be the same country, all belonged to China until 1929, under the influence of global communist movement, supported by the former Soviet Union. So the Mongolia government became to be an independent country. Prior to that, it's really dominated by Mongolian, which is nomadic type of practice. They have the same kinds of practice, culture, religion, and the government. So because of this split, and after World War II, the ecosystem, society, people, composition, economy, livestock, everything started to diverge, started this divergent process.
And what were some of the major differences, politically, economically, that you saw between those two regions over those years?
Right. The major difference is there are many. For example, let's say, look at the human population. And there has been a very, very high rate of population increase in Inner Mongolia compared to Mongolia, or some people call it after Mongolia. And today there are like 27 million people in Inner Mongolia, but there are still only about 2.7 million people.
Obviously, human factors, things like population and governance, are critically important to Chans. But what other sort of effects did you see?
Right. That's the major discovery of our study on this special issue. Is that we try to link ecosystem productivity in a way that's how much nature, which is grassland, desert, or forest, can provide to each of the country. By the way, two countries are similar in size, with Mongolia slightly larger than Inner Mongolia. So you can imagine the landscapes of Mongolia and the Inner Mongolia used to be very similar. Roughly, let's say 30% as a desert, or most people will know as the Gobi Desert, for example. And around roughly about 35 to 40% of the Mongolia Plateau are called grassland, and the remaining 10 to 15, 18% are forest. So with a similar, we call it natural setting or landscapes, or some people call them biomes. But you can imagine that ecosystem productivity, we call it net primary productivity, that is the amount of the carbon or biomass that can be fixed by the natural landscapes.
So how did you measure that?
We measure using a couple of ways. And the first data we used in this study is measured by satellites, remote sensing technology. So with similar ecosystem productivity in Inner Mongolia and Outer Mongolia, you would imagine that the livestock, those are the sheep, horses, cattle, all those livestock, it should be the similar, right? So you have the similar natural nature, and then that should support the same number of livestock. But but that's not the case. And several years ago, if you compare, let's say, 2010, there were 110 million livestock in Inner Mongolia. But yet, in Outer Mongolia, we have only about 40 million. So that's a puzzle. I know why do you have the similar landscapes or similar natural nature that can provide services for the same number of livestock, but yet in reality, the difference is like 2.5 times.
That's a surprisingly large difference.
Right, it's a very dramatic, and that's where we looked at. Well, it must be something else, and that's where we think the human or society, socioeconomic development are contributing to that.
This seems to speak to one of the benefits of the Chan's approach, because if you were looking at this from a really classical perspective and not, viewing the human elements with such granularity, you might miss a factor like this. You might not see the trend that's occurring in quite the same way.
You are absolutely right. For example, either livestock or other human, wildlife, plants population. The classical way is look at the logistic growth of a population. And then what it happens is with the limited amount of the resources, you can only support certain amount of population, including livestock. But now we see from Inner Mongolia is that capacity really exceeded what a logistic model may predict. And we attribute that elevated capacity is from human perspective. It's very ironic. By the way, I did my bachelor degree in Inner Mongolia back to very early 1980s. During my earlier college studies, I observed management of livestock. I saw herdsmen are still riding horses, chasing livestock across the landscape from one place to another place, carry their Mongolia yards or teepees around across the landscape, carry their food on the water. And then now, a couple of years ago, when I traveled to Inner Mongolia again, I saw people, herdsmen, I mean, they carried iPhone 5 in one hand, other hand they're driving Honda vehicles.
That's interesting. So, generally speaking, in Inner Mongolia, you have somewhat more of a technological society, and is it a more heavily urbanized society there?
That's not a separate issue about urbanization. I'm glad you mentioned that issue. It's a very different in terms of urbanization because of this rapid economic increase in Inner Mongolia, which is part of China. We have seen that China has been increasing in its GDP at a minimal rate of like 8 in the past 12 to 15 years. Inner Mongolia is no difference. Its economy just has significantly increased steadily and increased in the past, let's say, 15 years. So as a part of these economic increases and the value of livestock to the total GDP decreased because it's no longer that critical as you have more other heavy industry or mining industry. So then one of the way you can keep your livestock management is to have a larger livestock or broader region, right? So that we as a result of that, and then also means less number of employment for as a herdsman, and because you're the profit by practicing livestock management is not as high as like you find any job in the urban area. So that's one of the major points we argued in this paper is that there is a lot of the migration of herdsmen. They're leaving the villages and the herding practice to the cities because income is too low.
And I was hoping you could talk to us just a little bit about the implications of your research and research like it. Um, what does it allow governments, policymakers, and decision makers to do? How can they act on it?
The implication is that we know one cannot manage your natural resources, society, and the people without looking at how the co or coupled dynamics of nature and society. So it's very clear if you look at human history in the past 7,000 years. Started, let's say, Middle East area, like around Iran, Iraq, as pointed out by Jared Diamond. That's where the human civilization started. And back then, and in the past, let's say 6,000 years, and the human development or civilization really depended on the nature. But since the World War II or since the Industrial Revolution time, we're changing that trend, and we're getting more and more towards influencing, managing, or most of the time we're controlling the nature. I think one of the critical lessons for us is some way we know this economic development, population increase may not be unstoppable. However, what we need to learn is during this interaction, nature is limited. There is a finite amount of resources. And if we do not understand this coupled nature and human and the environment, I think someday we may face a critical challenge or a threshold point that may, in my opinion, someday that may cause the collapses of a government or a society or a region or a human civilization. I'm a little bit concerned there.
And one of the interesting things about your work is that it gives us the opportunity to look at those sorts of things in a quantitative way, and so that we can look at tipping points, not just in terms of abstractions and qualitative guesses, but we can actually sort of look at them carefully and make predictions.
That's the contribution of this paper. Indeed, in this paper, we, for the first time, we brought this quantitative measure of economic, social, and environmental measures all together. For example, it's very ironic that, well, for example, a general public, everybody understands what's GDP, and everybody understands the population. And for majority of people, also people understand what's ecosystem productivity. That's the amount of the biomass that a nature, grassland, forest, or desert can produce per unit area per unit time. But ironically, I don't know why we never brought those quantitative metrics together. For example, this is the first time we looked at how much GDP can be produced per unit ecosystem product. So the figure one, the diagram we presented in this paper, is really the first time try to demonstrate that we can look at the interactions and the feedback among the economic, social, and the natural ecosystem, and even including other important practice like livestock management. So however, I have to say that this is the first time, and we're only in earlier stage, very beginning of bringing all these quantitative measures, so that we can test or look for um, different options or prove the concepts of these coupled systems.
And that brings me to my last question, which is what's next? What are you studying now, and what's the future of these approaches?
Well, the future of this is we're trying to narrow it down into specific policies. Right now, in this study, we have not looked at how specific policy or change may contribute to the changes of the overall chance or the human natural system. For example, we know the former Soviet Union abandoned Mongolia in 1991. That's also known as the collapse of former Soviet Union.
Right.
So we're trying to understand how that sudden government, or you call that institutional change, may contribute to the dynamics of chance.
Oh, that's a fascinating question. And why don't we leave it there, sort of as a glimpse into the future of Chan's research? We'll look forward to reading and hearing more. Thank you very much for joining me, Dr. Chen.
Well, thank you very much, too, for being interested in our research.
So that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences. To read the article we talked about today, point your browser to bioscience.oxfordjournals.org. Thank you for listening, and talk to you next time.